Osmani, and this is Fulbright Women Podcast Season 2. We're excited to bring to you 20 new brilliant women who are pushing the boundaries in their fields and lives and serving as inspirations to so many around them. Joining us today is Arman Ashraf. Arman attended Columbia University in 2016 and studied Developmental Psychology. Since her return, she has been working as a lecturer at Forman Christian College. She's in the process of applying for her PhD right now and is interested in motherhood and parenthood, more broadly as a developmental milestone. Finally, we're getting to do this, right?
Yes.
It's happening. I guess you have a lot to talk about your journey, but the first thing I want to ask you is, what got you into developmental psychology?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. So in my undergrad, I did my undergrad from FC College, and we had, a wide variety of courses that were offered there. Even when I was there, which was, some years back, now the program has grown considerably since that time. And whenever I, study any course, I'd be so sort of, sucked into it that I'd say, I want to major in this. But developmental psychology, particularly because I was very interested at that time in identity development. And that's something that I'm still very interested in terms of how do people, construct this idea of who they are, and how does that change then? How does that evolve? If we say that that's something that's primarily happening during adolescence, right? We do see that there are a lot of changes, a lot of different factors that contribute to how a person defines themselves. For example, the sort of career you end up in, or, the sort of family or the culture you belong to, for example, right? So there's so many different factors that we have to consider when talking about identity development. So that's one thing that really, really, I was very interested in. And then I was very interested in looking at how children develop. And then another age group that I was very interested in at that time was looking at elderly individuals, because I was very close to my grandparents. So that's another thing, that I really wanted to look at. But, even in the United States, a lot of developmental psychology programs are geared more towards childhood, not so much towards the elderly. So yes, that's how I got interested.
It's so interesting because you talked about identity, right? As a filmmaker myself, I have really focused on the idea of identity. It has really intrigued me. So it's going to be fun talking to you about this. In your understanding, in your experience, do you think identity is fluid? The idea of identity is fluid?
One of the things I noticed was that as soon as I gave birth, right, though, that whole process had huge consequences for my identity. So that's something, identity is something that's fluid, that's changing, that's always evolving. It's a constant evolution. You're constantly responding to events in your life, and that's how, you're evolving as a person.
So then with that understanding, right, developmental psychology becomes even more crucial. You're looking at people at, different ages and different stages. There's biological, physical, even cognitive changes that are happening in us, right? What are some of the tools and methods that you have learned that one can use in studying these different areas at different stages when it comes to identity?
So usually what you see is that with Erickson, a lot of, whenever you're building a theory about identity, for example, you're doing a lot of qualitative research, or, you're using more inductive forms of research. Now the idea of identity has become more differentiated, right? So you're talking about measures, when you're talking scales, you're looking at things that like, for example, ethnic identity, or you're looking at things like gender identity. So rather than looking at identity as a whole, you've sort of fragmented it into these different parts. However, this is another thing that I talk to my students about as well, because I've been working as a lecturer since the past, I believe, 3-4 years now. So one of the things because in psychology, I'm not sure how much you're aware of this, but most mainstream, tracks are quantitative. And that's great. However, one of the things that happens is that you lose a lot of indigenous ways of thinking when you're using quantitative methods, when you're, for example, using scales that have been developed, elsewhere on a completely different group of people in a completely different culture. So qualitative research can really help you uncover patterns that are more indigenous, that are more local. So that's one thing. I'm not sure how, research on identity happens in Pakistan. I know that, it's mostly a quantitative track in which you're sort of looking at these different branches of identity. So you might be looking at ethnic identity, you might be looking at gender identity, but not so much as, identity as a whole and what that might mean. And because, most research on identity then becomes, it's not just limited to psychology, it becomes, a track which is multidisciplinary. So you have, people from sociology, you have people from anthropology, from perhaps linguistics even, right, who are contributing to that kind of research.
So I will, definitely get into, quantitative methods of research in psychology a little later, but I want to touch upon qualitative, research that you just mentioned and that you proposed should be, one of the major ways of working around things. So now let's just talk about the context of Pakistan and qualitative research, right? What are some of the qualitative methods, explorative methods, and what are the challenges in adopting them in Pakistan?
Okay, so one of the ways, and which is very popular in research, in Pakistan, so qualitative research is still sort of developing in Pakistan because we're still stuck in that phase in which we're thinking, oh, numbers mean research, real research, and not, when you're doing qualitative research, that's still something that people are not very comfortable with. But when you talk about qualitative research abroad, there are many, again, it doesn't form the mainstream way of doing research. However, one of the more popular methods is something that we call IPA, which is interpretive phenomenological analysis, which sort of, wants to look at the experiential worlds of people. It's not, focused on, so for example, as a developmental psychologist, you come across a lot of different, phases. In, for example, there's a lot of research that tries to set these, sorry, the word is completely escaping me, but there's a particular, for example, age at which a child starts to walk. There's a particular age when the child says their first word, right? So developmental milestone, sorry, right? However, as a parent, right, when you are, raising a child, you will see that every child's development is completely different, right? And that's what you lose out on in quantitative research. When you're drawing on averages, that's what you're losing out on. You're losing out on the nuance of experience, on the subtleties that make up life for, what they are, right? So that's basically what I believe, ought to be the focus. And IPA, again, it looks at the experiential worlds of people. So for example, if you're looking at a topic such as what are the experiences of women in dealing with, menstrual symptoms, right? So if you're using IPA to do that, what you're essentially doing is that you're stepping inside their shoes, understanding how they, make meaning of their period. Is it something that's a nuisance? Is it something that, gives them a break from household chores, right? So that's what you're really getting into, rather than sort of just giving them a questionnaire that's been pre-created by individuals mostly who are not very, very aware of the sort of place they're coming from, right? And in which they have to limit their experience to that questionnaire or that survey.
That's correct. I think in a way that's just a way of, simplifying the simplifying every process for the sake of your own comfort and convenience, so that you don't really have to dive deeper into, understanding each case, right? So how are people proposing that there should be more qualitative methods and approaches? I'm sure there must be some kind of resistance, because some kind of backlash, some kind of resistance, in their pursuits to make qualitative approaches more mainstream.
I think so. Qualitative research is not more mainstream as of now. Therefore, quantitative research does not see it as a challenge at all. I'm not against quantitative research methods. A lot of times, the research that you have with quantitative research methods, that can really give you good qualitative research questions. For example, if you see there's a correlation between two different variables. So for example, if you see that, there's one correlation that I came across by this researcher, and she'd done this research on Pakistani mothers. And what she saw was that unplanned pregnancies are, they're correlated with a greater risk of postpartum depression. right? So you have this correlation there. And then as a qualitative research, you can ask, how is it that these two variables are connected? That's something that quantitative research is not telling you. So in essence, they're complementing one another. It's not that you have, qualitative as, a replacement for quantitative.
I understand what you're saying, they kind of complement each other. And while both of them have their own merits, right? Uh, Help me understand this a little bit, because my research tells me that there's a growing consensus on how quantitative methods can be Eurocentric in some ways and thus not always very helpful. What do you think about that?
Definitely. So because see, when we are, especially, this is not just quantitative methods, right? When, for example, and this is something that, as a post-colonial nation, I believe that we do come across a lot of, in the sense that when, students are sitting in a classroom and they're studying from a textbook, which has been written in the United States, right? And when they're, looking at all of the examples that are given, right, that is the standard then, right? And whatever they're experiencing is measured against the standard always, right? So your experience is always measured against a standard, because research is happening, unfortunately, the basic center of psychology is the United States, fortunately or unfortunately, right? So the thing is that it's not just limited to the skills, it's the way that, a discipline is conceptualized. So for example, we have this idea in developmental psychology, which talks about attachment styles. And, attachment style research is becoming very popular in everyday, sort of discourses as well. So, you're talking about attachment styles, and you're talking about secure attachment, and you're talking about avoidant attachment, right? Now, that's coming from a place where researchers, that might be coming from a place where researchers or where people have these notions of, what the relationship between parents and children are, right? In cultures where you're not seeing any, sort of the way that you're identifying yourself, right, and the baby.
This is such an interesting thing that you're talking about, because attachment styles, even I was studying about that, and I noticed one thing, there's this term they use, codependency, right? And when I was having a
Yes.
conversation with a lot of friends of mine, Pakistani friends of mine, a lot of times we had difficulty understanding that concept because, right, what certain times the definition of codependency or examples of codependency were just normal, environments and behaviors and family structure and relationships for us, right? Can you give me more examples like that?
Yes, exactly. Like, with codependency, for example, again, it's because the way that we construct or conceptualize ourselves, right, might be in relation to other people, right, might be in relation to, what sort of ethnic background you have, or the fact that, you have a particular number of siblings, or the fact that your, siblings work in particular areas, for example, in the government, or, as a civil servant or whatever, right? So the reason is that we're identifying so much of ourselves, right, with those around us, right? And that might not be the same way, that might not be the same case in a lot of nations from which these theories are sort of coming from, right? And then what we do is that we use these theories and we reflect on our own behavior. And then, what we do is that we start thinking that there's something wrong with our behavior because it's completely driven out of context. So that's what I'm saying, that this is something that's happening, right? When you're looking at, for example, research on self-esteem, perhaps. So a lot of, there was a time in my class and a student of mine, she spoke up and she was like, can you believe it? There's not even an Urdu equivalent of the word self-esteem. And she said it like, that, as a culture, we're so, sort of not focused on developing self-esteem that there's not even an Urdu equivalent of it. So again, what is that an example of? That's an example of equating two cultures with one another, forming a standard with a Western culture, and then using that standard to evaluate your own culture. And that's always something that's, it's not going to give you a very deep understanding, a very profound analysis of what this other culture is about, because, you're already measuring it against, some that you've created.
Yeah, same as depression, I guess. I found people say, oh, what is depression? That's why perhaps people, it's a difference of language. We're talking about language and using language as a barometer, right, as a yardstick for something, for concepts, right? We might have concepts in our cultures, but just not the same word to understand that. Talk about that.
Right. Exactly. And this is one of the things. So I teach this qualitative research methods class at FC, and we were just talking about Foucauldian discourse analysis, which is basically this method of analysis that tries to relate the concepts of discourses with power and talks about how language, it cannot be separated from power structures, right? And it cannot be separated from agency, right? So, that's a very, very interesting take then on language, because it, basically what it does, and one of the assumptions that it seeks to deconstruct is, the assumption that we have in the cognitivism way of thinking about psychology. So again, a mainstream way of doing psychology is through cognitivism, through thinking that, thought is primarily what you should be studying, right? And that language is merely translating thought, right? So that's an assumption that we have, that whatever our thoughts are, we use language to translate them. But discourse analysis, takes an exception to that and says that that's not true. Language is constructing thought. It's not only translating thought, right? And it talks about how there are no consensual objects of thought. If you and I are talking about, let's suppose you and I are disagreeing about Aurat March, and you say, I have a different opinion about Aurat March, and someone else has a different opinion, right? So what discourse analysis will say is that it's because the way that we're conceptualizing Aurat March is completely different. It's not that there's something which is Aurat March and we have different opinions on it, right? Our whole conceptualization of this phenomena is different, and that's why we do not agree, right? So that's, again, a very, very interesting take on language and power, right? And then even agency. So for example, I do this example, which is fun for students as well, in which I try to ask them that, in Urdu, how would you say that a cat had kittens? And they say, Billi ne bacche diye. But how do you say that with people? You say, unke haan bachcha hua. The way that you talk about something, right? It gives you particular positions from which you can act. So yes, this is a bit about.
This is also interesting because the agency and the power and the language that you're talking about, there's also the same concept. I think the same concept can be applied anywhere and everywhere, right? Relatability, the vocabulary that you're using, communication that is happening, right? And
Yeah.
I understand that the whole quantitative method or the Eurocentric methods that we try to impose on our, kind of studies without understanding the context of our cultures is such a dangerous way of understanding so many things. And I kind of want to tie it back to the attachment theory that you were talking about, because at the end of the day, and we're going to tie it segue into later what you're interested in, parenthood and motherhood, right? So relationships, how a lot, there's a generational gap then, because a lot of us are studying and have access to all these European or American studies and research and vocabulary and literature, and our parents may not have the same access to them. They have their own concepts about certain things. Both may not be wrong. I don't know. Nobody's wrong, right? I'm not getting into that debate, but it creates a friction within the family system, within the household, right? The whole thing about codependency, the whole thing about, communication. This is dangerous.
Definitely. And, one of the things that I say to my students as well is that, the fact that you're studying in this kind of, bachelor's honors environment, you have access to these ideas, you have access to these books, right? You might have more in common with an American undergraduate than someone from, let's suppose, a less developed area of Pakistan, right? So when we talk about culture, again, we need to, sort of problematize that as well. That culture is not what is Pakistani culture? If you talk about it, if you say that we need to think about it in Pakistani cultural context, right? So there's so many layers to that culture as well, right? There's so many, for example, if you're doing research, what gender are you working with? What socioeconomic class are you working with? Are you working with people from Northern Punjab or Southern Punjab? Are you working with people from Sindh, Balochistan, KPK, Gilgit? It's going to create a huge amount of difference, right? So, even when we talk about in psychology, for example, we say we have to think about cultural context. But even when we are thinking about cultural context, there's so many layers to it that might sort of, whitewash an entire culture saying, yes, it's Pakistani culture. And in that way, I feel that FC is it brings forth a wide variety of individuals from different areas of Pakistan, and they have the ability to then critically analyze all of these different factors. So that's another thing. Another thing is that, when we're talking about identity, for example, one of the things that I've noticed is that when you're talking to individuals, right, for example, when I'm in a classroom and I say, let's introduce who we are, right? You belong to a majority group. If you're, for example, Punjabi, Sunni, you are a boy, for example, you will sort of ignore all of these markers and you will talk about something more abstract. For example, you'll say things like, I'm a human being, right? Versus if someone comes from a more minority culture, they're more, free to come up with, I'm Shia or I'm Ahmadi and, I am from, let's suppose, Sindh, right?
This is so interesting. These social markers that you're talking about, and like the big cities versus small cities, getting better education, private education versus going to government schools, right? And even if you look at it in a universe, like a broader context, not just Pakistan. See, I'm going to give an example of, we do not bring up so much about our religious identity in our daily conversations when we are living in Pakistan, right? But you look at, the diaspora, right? The Muslim, population, say in the States or anywhere else, right? Where they're in a minority. I loosely term it as a minority syndrome, right? But I think that is what you're touching upon here, to hold on to your identity even stronger.
Definitely, that's something that you experience, when you are abroad and when you're part of a minority culture. So you have, this propensity to hold identity out. That's why so many individuals will start, sort of dressing up in a way that shows more of their identity, asserts more of their identity, and then that sort of ties back. It sort of ties into the debate that's ongoing in India, for example, in which there's this whole dispute about the hijab. And how, and it's very interesting because what they say is that colleges are not sites for sort of marking your identity, but then what you see is that schools, colleges, all of these, they are not devoid of politics. Nothing is devoid of politics.
If we take the same thing but look at what's happening in, let's say, it may not be the perfect representation of this example, but the same thing, in terms of Aurat March, right? And the minority syndrome can also be applied to the gender whole thing, right? So women wanting to really dress however they want to in Pakistan, that may be a very different thing when we look at it from the lens of Aurat March, and then we look at what's happening in India, right? And this is just the human urge to be able to express and communicate, right? What they think is their identity and be able to just live freely.
I was just going through this book by Judith Butler, Gender Trouble. And in that, she problematizes the concept of identity itself as well. And she talks about how this is also, a sort of construction that has come up. But yes, it's very much a part of mainstream culture, how we define ourselves, how we, sort of talk, that has, consequences of how we, think about ourselves, how we, it has consequences for our subjectivity, how we feel, right? So yes, and it'd be interesting to see a poster of Muskan Khan with the slogan, Mera Jism Meri Marzi, because that's essentially what she's saying as well, that it's her choice to wear whatever she wants. And that's essentially the same principle that, women in the Aurat March are also, speaking about.
I think the whole issue is, about, in this case, about thinking that a piece of fabric is representing something, bigger than you. No, it is about the choice that you're making, right? And that choice, I think, also ties back to the idea of identity, right? And the problem that the concept of identity and holding on to one identity can sometimes portray and present, because what you were talking about Judith Butler earlier on, right? I understand that, because holding on to one form of identity, and this ties into your developmental psychology as well, right? If at the age of 12 I decide what my identity is and this is what I'm going to hold on to for my entire life, that is problematic, right? Identity to me as well is, like we started off this conversation with, is very fluid and is kind of a spectrum that you keep hopping around on, right? As long as You understand, because you grow, you evolve, you learn, and you adapt to things, right? So I understand the concept of, just problem that can, arise from just holding on to one identity and being rigid about that. But you mentioned something about critical thinking earlier on, and you mentioned about FC College, of course. As a lecturer, Arman, how do you encourage critical thinking among your students? I understand you said there's a wide array of students coming from all sorts of backgrounds, so that would be helpful. But then, how you as a lecturer are encouraging that among your students?
Okay, so I think one of the first ways that I encourage that is to be interactive. So my classes, I try to always structure them in such a way that they're interactive. So I'm not the only one doing the talking. So, talking is going back and forth. Another thing that I did notice during, my introductory psychology classes, and this might get me in trouble with some administrative people at FC, is that if you start using Urdu as well as a medium of instruction, which is something I wasn't comfortable with because I'd also studied psychology my whole life in English. But if you start switching between the languages, it creates a lot of interaction in the class for some reason. Suddenly the interaction goes up. I haven't really done a research on this, but if I were to make an estimate, it goes up 50%. Definitely. More, students are sort of willing to participate, more of them. If you give them more real life examples, for example, I was teaching students classical conditioning in which you're sort of pairing out different stimuli. And I said, yes, if you, for example, are in love with someone and you smell their perfume, and then later on the perfume reminds you. And my husband, this was an online class, and my husband's like, what the hell are you talking to your students about? This is not okay. But yes, it makes for greater learning because it's something that will stick to them. It's an example that is more relevant.
Relatable. Yeah.
Exactly, right? But as a teacher, you're supposed to have that distance and decorum as well, and I obviously understand that as well. However, so critical thinking. Another thing is that I try to make them analyze whatever it is that they're studying. I try to make them write reflections in which they, I talk about how do these ideas relate to your own lives, especially when we're doing developmental psychology and we're studying about emotional and social development. So I always make them write reflections in which they're basically talking about how key ideas relate to them. So in, the latest reflection that I was just grading, students talk a lot about how when they read about these attachment styles, so they went and they talked to their mother about them and they asked them, what was my behavior when you used to leave? What was it when I came back, when you came back, what was my reaction like? So yes, it's engagement that they're, sort of participating in. And then, sort of designing assignments and quizzes in such a way that they're analyzing more than just, sort of memorizing different concepts. So I always give open book exams, and I usually prefer papers in the place of, sort of exams. So, sort of making them think how the concepts apply to daily life. How can they use the concept that they're studying about to change something in the world around them? So how can the concepts that they're studying inform policy? How can they write to a policymaker and say that, this is the sort of policy that should be in place because I, as a student of developmental psychology, have studied that this really works for children. So this is what, these are some of the techniques I try to use. Other than this, I just try to make them analyze it. I just try to talk to them about it in the sense that, how do you feel? Do you feel that this applies to your cultural context? Do you feel that this makes sense? And yes, that's pretty much it.
Interesting. And this is you doing all of this in the role of a lecturer, in the role of a teacher. And I know that you are also in the process of applying for PhD, and
Yes.
you're personally interested in exploring, the concept of parenthood and motherhood. Let's just talk about that a bit.
Right. So basically, when, and especially when you're living in a culture like Pakistan and you have gone through the medical system here as related to reproduction, you would understand better why someone would want to do a research on parenting. And I've been thinking about it that I should also do a research on experiences of mothers, as related to medical stuff inside, hospitals. Anyway, but yes, coming back to the PhD bit. So basically, when I became a mother, I sort of, noticed that I was a very different person, right? That I had suddenly become very different in terms of my emotional responses to different stimuli. Cognitively, I was different. Perhaps and this is, I don't want to just talk about how there were deficits in cognitive thinking, but I can only think about how my memory was affected. That, for example, initially I was working at, I always remembered faces of every student that I ever taught, so I could, remember them. After that, I did not know who was who. So, huge deficit in memory. Even now, for example, I had to set an alarm for the podcast because it's very, very possible that I'll completely forget about it. Like, things just come and go, like they have a life of their own now. So, memory was something that, really, really suffered. I'm sure some other areas might have grown. I'm not sure. I cannot really comment on that. But there were emotional changes. There were physical changes, definitely. My body would not respond to the same regimen of exercise, to the same diet, the way that it used to when I had not had the baby. And then I started reading up on this, and I saw that, and this is a professor that I wasn't familiar with while I was at Columbia. However, she'd written a lot about reproductive identity. So she'd written about how women, when they're going through parenthood, when they're giving birth, essentially, right, they are birthing a new mother as well. They're not birthing a new baby, but a new mother as well, who is, when we talk about developmental milestones, we're always talking about cognitive, emotional, and physical changes. And this is, a milestone which has all three of these changes. So why is it not considered a milestone in its own right? Especially when you do see that there are differences now in how you conceive yourself as well, right? It might not be, it's not necessary that women start conceiving themselves completely in relation to the child. That's, again, imposing an idea of motherhood upon. But, there are definitely changes that they're struggling with, right? That they're dealing with, that they're undergoing. And that's basically what I wanted to study. That, what are women experiencing? And this, I felt, could only be studied from a qualitative lens, because you're exploring, again, even when we talk about medicine, what we see is that literature on mothers is something that's very lacking. Even in psychology, usually you're looking at maternal mental health only in how it relates to the child's well-being. So that's one thing that I felt that, it was important to talk about, that, and especially because, the way that women term it here in Pakistan is that you'll be free, after 9 months, you're going to be free, right? You're going to get it over with when the whole, labor process happens and the baby's out. it's just done. However, the real journey starts after that, because the consequences to your identity, the consequences to your physical health, the consequences for your cognitive, health, all of those come about later. And even perhaps during pregnancy, actually, they're happening. But yes, once the baby's there, then it's a whole different journey, and nobody really talks about that journey.
Yes. There's why is there like this shame, some kind of shame attached to, women just talking about their experiences when the real journey really starts after the 9 months? But like you said, right? How they're dismissed. Oh, it happens to everyone. It's nothing. You'll be fine. You have a kid to look after. You have a family. You should be happy. Why aren't you happy? Why, those things, being dismissive about women's experiences and attaching shame to their expressions.
Definitely, that is something that exists. I remember telling my HOD this, because I shared some of my experiences with him. And I remember telling him this, that, I feel like this whole culture is geared up against women, and it's it's geared up, it's sort of ganged up against women, right? It's constantly telling you what you're doing wrong. It's constantly telling you how you're inadequate. Because, if you look at middle-class women in Pakistan, what you'll find is, surprisingly, most of them do not breastfeed. And the reason for that is because they're constantly told that, their breast milk is not enough for the baby. This is something that exists in our literature, not in our literature, but in our culture so much. And this is something you will not find any basis for this in literature, that, basically lactation experts will tell you there's no such thing as a mother not producing. That's something very, very rare. But it starts from there, telling you you're not sufficient to provide food to your baby. But, yes, also that, there's, if you try to find literature on postpartum experiences, right, you'll find literature on postpartum anxiety, on postpartum depression, but there are a wide variety of mothers who do not fall, in those extremes, postpartum anxiety or postpartum depression, but they're still struggling and there are no resources for them. There are no, even if you read about other people's experiences, that can also serve as validation. That can also make you feel that you're not going crazy. And, that makes you feel, sort of validated. It makes you feel that other people are there, who've experienced similar things. Because again, what you're saying that, if you try to share it with others around you, especially in our culture, it's something that they will not listen to most often.
Exactly. So, having talked about, the need for it, once you get your PhD, fingers and toes crossed for that. Once you get it, what are the certain, areas of application that you're looking at? How do you want to apply it? I understand, but like talk about the specificity of that. How do you want to apply it?
Right. So one of the things that I wanted to do is that, for example, I really want to introduce in Pakistan this discourse about maternal mental health, right? And focusing on that. So when we talk about, maternal leave, for example, or, what maternity leave policies are, right? I do believe that there should be policies geared, inside institutions, inside, for example, hospitals, right? That they are doing checks on mothers, maternal mental health, that they're focusing on that. That's an area that they're interested in working with. Right. So that's one thing, so for example, policy changes. That's something that's very, very ambitious, so to say, but also creating awareness. So one of the things that, happens with qualitative research is that when you're doing that kind of research, you're using people's experiences, right? And you're trying to make their experiences available to public, right? And again, that kind of research can be very empowering, especially in this case, because when you have that kind of awareness, when you have that kind of preparation, right, that yes, once I go into being a mother, these are the changes that I can anticipate and expect, right? So that I believe can help you somewhat, at least.
One question before I let you go. Um, in collecting the, data, right? In collecting the sample, I'm talking completely in the context of Pakistan right now. We have already established and we know that there's so much shame in expressing when it comes to mothers and their experiences, right? It limits also and it discourages a lot of mothers to even open up about it, right? Do you anticipate those kind of challenges when you set out to collect that kind of data?
Okay, so one of my experiences in doing qualitative research has been the opposite, that people love to talk about themselves. They love to express. There's this quote in, one of the novels by Gabriel Garcia Marquez as well, that, if you drag someone to a police station and you just have them sit there and tell their life story, they'll gladly do it. They won't mind that it's in the context of a police station, right? So I sort of do believe that, because one of the things that you have to be smart in terms of when you visit women, when you want to talk to them. You should ideally do it in the morning when the husband isn't home so that they can talk. You have to make sure it's an environment where other people in the house are not, they cannot listen, because if it's something that's it's within hearing distance of other family members, that might have consequences. So one of the roles of a researcher is also to protect the participants, is to protect the best interests of the participants. So it has to be in that kind of environment, right? I do believe that it's because women might not have a lot of resources, a lot of ability to express with other individuals who are not so keen to hear. With someone who is keen to know about their experiences, you might have more of them opening up. There are challenges, obviously. So if, for example, you come across a person who you feel is experiencing postpartum depression, how do you deal with that then? So you have to sort of think about these things and prepare for all kinds of possibilities. If you feel, and a lot of women who have postpartum depression do not harm themselves or the baby. This is something that I believe. This is again a misconception. But if you do believe that there are chances that they will end up harming themselves, what do you do in that case? So you have to have a list of specialists on board who will, see these people. You have to have a list of resources on board, which this person can contact if there is that kind of issue. But yes, I do feel that it's more of the opposite, that people are usually, and it depends on how, see, again, it depends on you as the researcher as well, and your interviewing skills. How good are you at sort of disarming people, at having them, open up to you, at having them trust you? So you have to have, a non-judgmental attitude towards them so that they can feel free to talk.
I completely agree there with the individual's capacity of convincing the other person to get access to their story. But personally, don't you think like and this is not for everyone, but a lot of women in Pakistan, right? The idea of agency, the idea of sharing their stories with or without the permission of the men, male figures in their families. So like something, I just picked on one of the examples that you were giving earlier, right? Going to people's places when the husbands are not at home, right? It could work in certain areas, but it could also not work because women sometimes are also, advised not to even open their doors when the husbands are not home, right? Do you think about that challenge at all?
So again, the interviews do not have to be based inside the residences. They can be done at, for example, medical centers that the women are, visiting, for example, for the vaccination processes, procedures for, the infants. They can be done at, medical centers. Otherwise, if there's a, problem that the woman is experiencing, and for that, she's getting medical treatment. And, if you're looking at smaller communities, then there are ways in which you can talk to an elder at the community and have them have their permission so that you can then get to the local population. But till now, I have not sort of thought about looking at smaller communities. I'm basically more focused on cities and the sort of medical systems we have here, because that's another cultural context altogether. So that's what I'm personally more focused on. And I feel that, with this kind of context, perhaps the men are not even interested. For them, child, bearing and anything related to it is just a woman's concern. And they might not think it's so important that they need to, sort of have a say in it at all. I mean, I might be overly optimistic about that, and I might.
I do think you're overly optimistic about that. But yeah,
Yes.
the mindsets are changing for sure. And I think I agree with you there. At least begin somewhere where we have access, easier to get access before we dive into deeper, challenges, because as it is, we have so many challenges to take care of and tackle on, right?
Exactly, yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Arman, for taking up time for this conversation today. I had so much fun. And obviously, there's so many questions, but maybe we can do it once more again in the future sometime.